Well, we've got one for you. The Minneapolis riots. We all remember seeing that craziness on the news. We were into the COVID pandemic, and all of a sudden, we're watching a major U.S. city burn to the ground. We've got Mr. Mike Treat, who was at Ground Central. He was right in the middle of it and had the presence of mind to document what he saw, which he put into a book. Let's get right into it and hear about surviving such an instance and what he did with the people in his community to get through a very horrible time. The book is called Minnehaha Falling. Let's get into it with Mr. Mike Treat on the Higher Line.
Welcome to another episode of the Carry Trainer Higher Line podcast.
Hey all, welcome to yet another episode of the Higher Line podcast. This one is going to be super interesting. If you see behind our guest today, Minnehaha Falling, this is a deep dive into a look at some of the craziness that happened in the 2020 Minneapolis riots. We've got Mr. Mike Treat, who not only lived right in the middle of that chaos, but had the presence of mind to document it so he could create a book and share some of the stuff that happened to him and his family. So welcome him today, Mr. Mike Treat. And I'm just going to kind of let him dig in and unpack some of the experiences and lessons learned from what went on. Good morning, sir.
Hey, thanks for having me on, Mickey.
Yes, sir.
Good to be here.
Are
Higher
you
Line
still
extravaganza.
in Minneapolis?
What's that?
Are you still in Minnie?
No. We moved out of there 2.5 years ago.
Okay,
Yeah.
I thought
Yeah.
so.
Once we became empty nesters, they were like, we can move now. So yeah. We left that. We lived in that neighborhood for 13 years, where the events in the book take place. So
Little
yeah.
background on you. What's work and that kind of stuff look like, just so we know, where you're coming from your perspectives that you shared.
Formal education past high school. I got a law enforcement degree to do the Minnesota Peace Officer Standards training, because there you have to have a license. I was pursuing being a sworn officer for several years. He ended up over in state corrections, and just settled in over there and worked in that on and off for nearly 20 years. It was full time for 10 years, and I worked intermittently in that. Whenever they needed me to come in, and I would fill that in. Plus, on the side, I did a number of things. I've always been in some form of private security, be it, the early days of being the young flashlight cop, in college, working in the mall, to dabbled in EP for just a little bit, high risk protection agent stuff. The only thing I never touched was armored car work. I have friends who do that. I'm like, no thanks.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah, but
Done that too.
yeah, and then I had like a lot of people who are in your program here, also became a firearms and defensive firearms instructor as well. I taught at the state corrections Department of Corrections I worked at. I had taught defensive tactics there, control tactics, and we were going away from one system that we had all been using for years. It was just not effective, and they kind of gave us the green light to say, hey, develop what will actually work for you guys. So I got involved with that, and then I always kind of been teaching something anyway. And then kind of on the preparedness side of the house, I think that's where you and I first met, was in New Orleans in 2019 at TACCon. Yeah,
Yes,
because
sir.
I'd been following you for a few years when you started your channel here and everything. But yeah, that was but I said back then, yeah, I was just starting up my training company, Condition Orange Preparedness, which, and our whole thing was non-apocalyptic preparedness, not digging in, bunkers out and, going and living in missile silos or out in the backwoods, but like what the everyday person, regular earth people here are doing, or have to do. So
Sure. We all can't. There's not enough missile silos to go around.
I wouldn't want to live in one of those. I couldn't do that. I just no.
So,
No, I
so
like fresh air and sunlight.
yeah, sunlight's a great thing. Yeah. Sitting
Yeah.
on your back porch having a coffee or a whiskey. I kind of wanted people to understand that you're bringing to this discussion a body of life experiences that kind of make you a unique person to dig into that. I mean, you could interview 1,000 people that lived in the same block, and you'd
Mhm.
probably get 1,000. You'd get 1,000 different experiences, regardless. But you've got dozens of years of doing work and thinking about these things. So it lends to the story. So you guys are living in Minneapolis. You're working up there. My parents lived up there,
Oh,
by the
really?
way.
Oh,
I think they were on Chicago Avenue, if
okay.
that rings a bell. My
Yeah,
dad was
that.
in school up there. My sister Karen was born there, my older sister
Okay.
Karen. So this is, we're talking 50 years ago. My dad
Hmm.
was uh my dad was in North Central Bible College there. I don't even know if it still
Oh, yeah.
exists. But dad does
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
I think they
And that's right in the area where
Mhm.
this kicked off. Yeah.
Yeah, right.
Hmm.
So lay it out. Just one more point. So to you guys listening, if you forgot, this
Hmm.
is the riots that kicked off after George Floyd incident in Minneapolis. So I'm gonna shut up now.
Yeah, and we're running up on 5 years ago when that
Yeah,
happened. Already been that
yeah,
long.
it's crazy.
Um, yeah, the backstory to this is the pandemic. That with the lockdowns that we had, and because being in the I was Minnesota was one of those states like Illinois, California, New York, Wisconsin. Only there they had the Supreme Court overruled their governor's lockdown orders and opened things back up partially, but um, that already had really taken an effect, and we also had protest occupations going on in front of the governor's mansion for about a month prior to all this for to open things back up, and there were armed protesters standing outside of that people openly carrying long guns and voted a certain way. I'll leave it at that because I
Mhm.
don't like to get too political in this stuff, but um so that, and then it was just this weekend where you had stuff still locked down, everybody's outside, and the weather was perfect. So and then so something was going to happen, and the incident with George Floyd, that was just the match. It was
Mm.
already, the tinder and the fuel was already there, and it just needed a match, and that was it. Um, so when that happened, now you have a bunch of people who are not at school or not at work, or they're able to have a little bit more time to go out and be active in this.
Yeah.
Um, and we had prior to all this, and I talk about this in the book, the history behind previous officer involved deaths and shootings in Minneapolis had sparked protests and occupations in the years leading up to this, including one in 2014, Thanksgiving week in 2014. I talk about this, and it wasn't an incident that happened there. It was based on the Ferguson decision,
Mhm.
the Michael Brown shooting.
Michael Brown. Yeah.
Yeah, and just a solidarity protest that sparked up that week. Again, a lot of students were home, and so they were able to take to the streets and have these large, marches and everything from the college campuses. And in that particular one in 2014, um, the third precinct had a protest outside that actually had turned violent. Even though this wasn't something that happened in our city, but it did. There was an incident where a motorist got trapped inside the crowd, um, and crowds do what they do. Some work together and try to resolve things peacefully and get vehicles and people who aren't involved out, and then there's others who um, are doing their own thing and decide to get violent and turn on the The motorists are the non-participants. But I talk about that in the book. And it was, one person was injured in it. But it was the thing that particular incident showed me was like the local population. I talk about this in the book where a barista that I always saw at a coffee shop, was just fired up about this and kind of the group think that happens. And again, 2014. Now fast forward to 2020, and groupthink is really something else with like, with the knowledge that we had of the pandemic going on and all this stuff, we're revisiting these days, you see it all over social media and about how it was back then, how whatever it was. But um that right there, it's pretty interesting how, and frightening how quickly people can get really wrapped up into um, thinking and behaving in ways they wouldn't normally, even those who aren't directly at a scene or an
Mhm.
event, you know. Um, so anyway, when that story broke, the morning after George Floyd's death, uh, I woke up and saw this on the local news, the viral video, and immediately I'm like, yeah, I knew. I was like, yeah, this is going to turn into something. We all knew that. We weren't sure quite how big, but we had prior incidents of this
Mhm.
to as a thumb, a rule of thumb or a gauge to
A barometer of sorts.
yes,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Um, I need a little bit more coffee apparently. Been doing more writing word than spoken lately.
The interesting thing you're talking
Yeah.
about that we're 5 years after this event, and now the general public is just starting to see some of the facts of that event. And I don't
Yeah.
want to make the discussion about that event. By that, I'm referring to George Floyd's arrest, subsequent death. Talking about, you mentioned a
Mhm.
moment ago, people having this uh, maybe feelings or getting visceral or angry. I had
Mhm.
family members um, that are pretty. It was not non-typical for them, but were outraged because, like they said to me, like he was murdered on TV, and I said, well, wait a second. Like
Mhm.
I've been practicing grappling for 20 something years, like that doesn't do, and I don't want to make the discussion about that, but like
Right.
most of us know, like that's not what we're looking at. I just was watching some of the court proceedings the other day, and stuff that's happening with uh, Chauvin, and information suppressed, and people just they don't even
Yeah.
care. I don't
Yeah.
want to look at this. I don't want to know that because I feel this way and this way feels good to me, and I'm just going to continue to be okay with it. And that led to years of cities being tore up. F you, I'm not interested in
Yeah.
truth, and I'm not suggesting that everything that happened in that arrest was correct by any means, but people talking about how much fentanyl was in dude's system. Like, well, let's not talk about that.
Right.
Let's not even discuss that. Let's just continue destroying cities. So back to your point. You saw this go down, and you're like, man, this is going to do something.
Yeah. Um, and again, we had that previous protests about 5.5, 6 years prior. We also had another high-profile officer-involved shooting in 2015, um, November of 2015, in North Minneapolis, the fourth precinct, and that was the Jamar Clark shooting, and that led to an occupation of the street outside of the fourth precinct there for that was not quite 3 weeks. That actually led to a quote counter protest.
I remember that.
Yeah. Okay. See, very few know that unless you're from that. And actually, there are local people who have just forgotten about that. But that did involve a few people being shot and somebody getting several years in prison out of it. Uh, between protesters and the occupation, and then the people who showed up to counter protests. I leave that to the court. They made their judgment on that.
Mm-hmm.
But that also uncovered a lot of other interesting details. I'll leave that for the readers in the book. We won't dive too much into that. But that occupation, that at the very least, we figured, hey, that's probably what's going to happen. Is there will be people setting up tents in the streets and camping out there 24/7. And here's the thing: that area where the third precinct is, your listeners and viewers, if they want to go on Google and look up Minneapolis third precinct, that particular location, and I talk about this in the book, strategically is perfect for an occupation, for a protest, for what actually became an urban insurgency. I'll call it what it is. That's what we had. That's what it devolved into. Because there are large empty or open lots, closed businesses, where a lot of the looting took place. That was a perfect staging ground for peaceful protests, but also, as we had seen then, they were the cover for the agitators, and then later on um, the insurgents. And there were insurgents there. Even our governor, who ran for vice president here recently, even went on TV saying that this was, nothing short of urban warfare and guerrilla tactics being used in our city streets. Well, bad enough that we had to bring out more National Guard than were ever activated in the state's history, including during World War II. So, yeah,
That's crazy.
something to the tune of a little around 7,000, if I remember correctly, a little over 7,000.
Why
Who were,
didn't you just
yeah,
jump in the family minivan?
yeah,
And why didn't you just haul ass out of there?
yeah. Um, that's the don't be there, right? So and that's a question I get asked quite often. Don't be there, or why did you stick around? The old saying of frog never knows it's in a pot of boiling water. Part of this was the distance from the 30th and Chicago Avenue site where Mr. Floyd was arrested um, and was taken to the hospital and passed away shortly after. Um, that became a vigil site. That was never really a protest site, but it was a vigil site. And so that was just under 2 miles away from our home, our block. It was equal distance from the third precinct, which was right up the street from us as well, just under 2 miles. So you have some immediate distance from the hot spots. You avoid those areas, you're going to be good to go. However, there, as that protest and those occupations of those areas begin to increase, there are people coming from outside your neighborhood. I won't say from out of state. There were those people, but a lot of the people who were there were from Minnesota or nearby, but most of them were from out of the neighborhood. Um,
Okay.
yeah. And so it's not right in front of it's not in your front yard. It's not on your street. It's down your street. It's not even in your immediate development that you live in, until you start seeing, after a couple days, people who don't really look like the usual, the people who live there. Because even if you don't know everybody, in a neighborhood where there's, say, I'll say 40,000 people, you live there long enough, you even if you don't know anybody, you recognize familiar faces, vehicles, routines. And I had a living of watching people and their routines, for years. That's all I did, was just observe people, um, and gather information. And that's what I did. Was I was like, okay, we're not in any immediate danger. Um, the first night of protesting that happened, the Tuesday night after George Floyd died, that did turn violent, and it made the local news, but they didn't really cover much of it. And partly it wasn't because they were suppressing anything or hiding anything. They just didn't have a lot of information to go on. Now, the research I did to write the book later on, there was a lot going on that, had I known that information, um, yeah, I would have packed up and, as you say, in the family minivan and bugged out right then. Um,
Mhm.
The other thing is, like, we were in the middle of a pandemic. Where would we go? The location we would have went to, and we ended up going to, we had, elderly people there with potentially compromised immune systems. And mind you, we're going off the information we had at the time about
Sure, sure.
the virus. So
Like anybody.
yeah, we don't want to get grandma sick. Um, and the other thing is we also had jobs, even though we were working remotely. And I had my daughter was at the time a junior in high school, uh, where she had a couple years, so she was probably a sophomore at the time. But um, she's already adjusting to not seeing friends and having that routine. And so you're trying to keep your family's routine down just for their own well-being. And again, there wasn't that immediate threat the first day or two. Uh, on the second day of this, then that that's when it got violent, and the rioting really kicked up, and the looting and burning started. But it was still contained to the area around the third precinct. Again, just under 2 miles from where we were. So there was no immediate threat still. But as it developed, you start seeing more and more people coming in. There's a routine to this too, I learned. Um, there are the people who come out, clean up in the morning. Then there's the early morning protesters who typically were stay-at-home moms and parents. And the peaceful protesters would come out, until about an hour before sundown. And
Hmm.
then that's when things change. And as the sun gets ready to go down, they go home. A lot of them have jobs to go to. They've got to get kids to bed. They got to, do this, their routines. Um, but but eventually that got taken over by, the more violent rioters, and then later on people who were just straight up trying to destroy the city for whatever reasons. And I'll just say right now, there was no particular group you could point a finger at. I was asked about 2 weeks after the riots. I was teaching a defensive handgun class about an hour outside of Minneapolis, um, and and then during a break, a student asked me, "Say, hey, who was that in there? Was that BLM? Was that Antifa? Who was that was in there and did all?" I'm like, I don't know. It could have been anybody. I just know they're whatever group. I just know it was a bunch of jerks came in and tried to destroy our neighborhood. And as it turned out later on, there were all sorts of groups in there. People who would oppose each other. People who would look at that area and say, these folks vote this certain way or live this certain way or they're whatever label we don't like. Let's go in and tear their stuff up. Um,
Hmm.
So, and they have that anonymity of the chaos and they exploit the chaos. The other thing is the criminal element that will exploit that as well. Aside from, just the opportunistic looting. Um, we later learned that I had a colleague in the protective agent business during the Dante Wright protest that happened a little over a year later, almost a year later. That there were actually looting teams who would go to these cities in advance, and they target specific stores.
They
And,
they they
mhm.
knew they have a plan.
Oh yeah. Well, and
Yeah.
if there's a bunch of books have been written about this. The Since then, um, but in one that I had read about was and some people may remember this from late September of early to late September in 2020, there were protests in Louisville on the decision made about um, the shooting that happened there, the Breonna Taylor shooting, and
Hmm.
the grand jury decision on that, and that led to protests, and there were some shootings that happened there as well. But there were lootings, and there were looting convoys who would operate outside the area where the police law enforcement couldn't respond. So they're like, okay, well, we know the areas they're not going to be in. We'll go hit those. Same thing happened in Philadelphia in September that same year. So these were professionals who were also doing looting. But then there were also um, more the residential areas like where I lived. It's a middle class, mostly blue collar neighborhood. A lot of old single family homes. And It been, developed probably became the neighborhood it is maybe about 90 years ago. So older homes there, but also a lot of people moving in from out of state. We had a lot of people from California moving into the area because it kind of fits their vibe, and cost of living was way lower. Um, and so they're coming in and they have a whole different take on it too. By the way, they people trash talk folks from California, but some of the advice they had actually was very useful, like wildfire management. Folks who know how to deal with staying at home, bugging in when there's a fire going on, and we had a lot of structure fires. It was like 1,500 businesses were destroyed in about as many fires. You may be 2 miles away from a fire, but those embers like to float on the breeze. It was so bad, in fact, all the fires we had, especially along the Lake Street corridor, this major business corridor and artery in South Minneapolis. One of the local meteorologists had showed on the morning news that it actually created its own weather system and pattern over the neighborhood from all those fires.
It had to be pretty noxious, man. All that burning
Yes,
debris and trash and building materials.
I remember it got to be about 3 days into it, and I was sitting in the living room with my daughter's doing her homework, and I'm sitting there, keeping up on all this stuff, running on 10 minutes of sleep a day for 5 days. Um, and at one point, we just looked at each other. I was like, "Do you smell? Do you taste that?" It was
Mm.
just everything was just like it was like having a it was like living inside of a fireman's coat. It's just
You
constantly
guys are living
smoky.
through this. You're sitting there every day, shit's
Yeah.
burning, you're watching the news, looking at stuff on the map, going, crap, that's across the street or the next block over.
Yep.
Were you thinking, or come on, police, let's run through here and push all these dirt bags out of here? Like, were you waiting for that to happen and it just never happened?
It got to that point 3 days into it. 3 days as in Thursday. So George Floyd died on Memorial Day, Monday. Protests started on Tuesday. Wednesday was when looting and structure fires began. And the third day of it, Thursday, the 27th of May, that was when the third precinct was given up. And that was when I started getting calls from neighbors who said, I'm seeing suspicious stuff. They had been anyway. I've been seeing, my neighbors who are gone, who went to their cabin up north a month ago because they're fleeing pandemic. Because everybody in Minnesota has a cabin up north. Not everybody,
Mm-hmm.
but people who
Yeah.
are they would be watching each other's homes when they were away, like good neighbors do. And they're like, yeah, there are people prowling around here. I don't know what to do. I've called 911. There's busy signal, or they have answered and said, we don't have anybody we can send you.
Mm-hmm.
Um, that wasn't my direct concern, was that. My concern was the firefighters aren't able to get all these blazes contained because they had equipment getting stolen and sabotaged. And it got to the point where the police, they're like, look, we're going to go out on medical calls and fire calls. We're riding with those guys, with the ambulances and the fire engines and trucks. Without saying it, it was pretty much, hey, sorry, folks, but you're on your own. The rest of the officers were directed to hold up and defend the precincts and key sites until the National Guard got there.
And this
Um,
point is one of the main points I wanted to have discussed today.
yeah.
That took 3 or 4 days to get to that point, to
Mhm.
have a major U.S. city devolve from some kind of law and order, call 911 because your tummy hurts, an ambulance is showing up. And we're so used to this, right?
Mhm.
I travel all over the country and there's tons of places where you're 30, 40, 50 minutes, 2 hours from even like a urgent care where it's
Yeah.
a couple nurses and a doctor and a handful of equipment, let alone a level 2 or 3 or even one trauma center. And you've got a major US city that in just 72 hours goes to the point of busy signal at 911, police stations, excuse me, uh, uh, overrun, burned, uh, firemen not having the equipment to fight fires. I mean, we see it like with the California fires going on right now. You guys listening, Mike and I are talking. What is today? The 16th of January
January.
2025. So the uh, fires just happening around LA are underway, and that's kind of like in the news right now. But none of these systems are made to handle this, which is, people say, well, that's why not? Who's going to pay for it? Like, where there's just not enough resources. It's not how the system's built, nor should it be built. Right?
Right.
That's like trying to build a house to withstand a nuclear blast. It just wouldn't make sense. Maybe that's a little bit, off the end of the spectrum, but these instances are so few and far between that the systems just get overloaded and can't handle it. So you guys, day 3, you're like, shit, if my house lights on fire, my neighbor's house, maybe the boys aren't showing up to put the flames out.
And that's where some of you found out who the neighbors were transplants from California. You'd see these people doing odd behavior that we don't do in Minnesota. We don't walk out with a garden hose, start wetting down a roof. You
Mm.
water your lawn, you don't water your roof. What's that about? It wasn't that it was really dry conditions, but these folks, were
Keeping
wetting
on
down their
top of it.
roofs. And, the neighbors who didn't understand it said, well, these fires are over almost 2 miles away. Someone, what are you worried about? Like, you don't understand. These embers can float for miles and land on these shingles. And I remember we had a neighbor who lived direct across the street. Um, their house, many years before all this, uh, the fire department showed up on a Saturday night to put out an attic fire. And turned out it was from a lightning bolt from a thunderstorm that hit the house Thursday night
Mm.
and slowly started this fire in their attic that didn't kick up until Saturday.
Something's slowly cooking up in that insulation. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So fire management became a thing that, um, luckily we had people around who knew about that, what it's like to, yeah, your firefighting system, it's overwhelmed. Folks who knew how to, okay. And they stuck around, um, until things got, you know, started getting violent and a lot more gunfire. That was where I came out. I was like, hey, you start hearing pop, pop, pop at night, get inside. And if you have a basement, just go sleep down there because those rounds got to come down somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
And, and people are out, checking roof shingles in the morning and to see what kind of damage there was. We didn't have any right on my block or immediate area, but some were pretty close. Um, and and then here's the thing with the
Mike,
medical
Mike,
system.
you lived in a single family home at the time?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, yeah. Um, it, as much as I'll say because of the previous the current owners who purchased it, I don't want to give up too much of their location.
Sure, sure. I just wanted to make
Yeah,
you end up, you were like in a 4 flat or something like that.
yeah, yeah. We had it was a 2-story with a basement. Pretty
Okay.
typical Midwest house, with neighbors like arms reach out the window close, very small
Mm-hmm.
lots. Um, but the medical system, that was the other thing too. We talk about, like, we teach these classes in remote areas where where we're doing our range safety briefing, and we come up and go over our emergency medical plan for the class. We might be, hey, like I said, an hour away from a major trauma center. We might have to air evacuate somebody out, or we might have to elect to transport them to a point where we can hand them off to an ambulance or air ambulance. We both taught in remote locations like that. That same plan for the evacuating from your range, I actually end up using that. Didn't have to use it, but that was my plan. I had, at the time I just bought a cargo van, and I was like, okay, well, that's going to be a makeshift ambulance.
Mm-hmm.
Loaded out with all the med kits and threw a tarp down and everything in case we had to transport somebody who had any major trauma. All while a pandemic is going on. and
Sure.
knowing where the nearest hospitals were. And by the way, the nearest ER trauma center was right in the middle of this stuff. So going into that, like, forget it, you know. We had to find, what would have been secondary became primary
Hmm.
hospitals to go to, and then and then the tertiary ones as well. Um, and I was familiar with that because I, had worked in corrections, so we had to take a lot of inmates to these hospitals for heart surgery or regular procedures, or whatever it may be, including hospice care a few times.
Sure.
So I was
Sure. Sure.
familiar with where they all were and where to go. But that was certainly the thing in 72 hours, like you pointed out, it seeing the thing that your tax dollars are paying for. Um, and these systems that you depend on, for, boo-boos and break-ins. It's like, yeah, this is where, no, we need the military to be just present to try to give an illusion of order being restored. You know,
Hmm. Yeah,
um,
good point. I think for you guys listening and watching, I've got a friend, Todd Fox is his name. Uh, One of his businesses is the rich and famous tour protection.
Mhm.
Uh, People like Roger Waters from Pink Floyd and dudes like that. So he travels the world and he does a class that's basically like this little truncated executive protection program for a family. So it's the same mindset. And one of the very important pre-planning things. So you and I are going on vacation to, I don't know, Montana to go on a fishing trip. If we were smart men, we'd figure out where are the hospitals? How will
Mhm.
we get there? If Mike breaks his leg, can Mickey get him out? How will we evacuate ourselves? And it might not be Montana. It might be New Jersey in a very big populated area. Well, at 3 o'clock in the morning, you don't want to be sitting there figuring out the street's on fire. Some shit popped off that you did not know was happening in this place that you're on a business trip or on a family trip, and now you have no idea where to go. So I think that is like a good adult thing to do. Wherever you go, just take 5 minutes and figure out on the Google map, and then screenshot that shit in case the internet's not working or you don't have a phone signal and you can't figure it out. Like, where are these places? Back to you.
And I think a really people want to know how to's. They want a cheat code book. They want to know, what do I do to be ready for this? We can certainly get into gear and stuff. People love to go shopping, right? That's what we're conditioned to do. Um, I would say first, have a good working knowledge of the geography of your area first, and second, the history of your area that you live in, and third, very important, the culture. Who are your neighbors? Who are your business owners? Who are the stakeholders in your area? Now, if you're abroad, you are traveling to an area for a business trip or something like that. Knowing the local stuff, like you were saying with where the major emergency medical centers. These are things that you would find anyway well, you used to find in old travel books.
Mm-hmm.
Um, or I think, I'm going to do a plug for somebody if that's cool. Our good friend Greg Elfritz, his book, Choose Adventure, traveling, safe travel in dangerous places, right? There's a lot in his book that came out at the time of this whole incident that happened. That I was reading his book and I was like, yep, a lot of this stuff applies to civil unrest. A lot of this applies to anything. You could be away from home when this happens. That's actually worse. The advantage I had was it was home turf. I lived there for, at the time, 11 years. I'd lived in that state for 30 some odd years. And and I also was a stakeholder in the community. I had been involved, for a while. I was involved in the art scene there, a really big art scene. It's great. There's some great stuff about that. Well, there used to be about that area I lived in. I really missed that. Um, but knowing the people and the culture there, even if I didn't know anybody by name, I could recognize a face. 40,000 people. You're going to see the couple who at your kid's kindergarten singing program. You're going to see them at junior high graduation. You're going to see them at, whatever PTA function later, or some street party event, whatever it is, but you get to know those people, your immediate neighbors, definitely knowing them, because the whole, I guess we could say, the preparedness community, there's this thing called MAGs, mutual assistance groups. Uh, and I had a couple friends locally who had those, and they were on standby to offer any assistance, but while they're helping out their own families, they're helping each other out. I was not directly involved with one of those, but the thing is, you may be cut off from those resources. Those people may not live in your neighborhood. They may have to come in to your area, or you can get to them. You're going to have a lot of ad hoc people working together. That's what we had. People who had never met each other were suddenly out in the street, um, holding down intersections when there were no police coming, setting up barricades of their own, be it vehicles, or in one case, there was one business owner who went and borrowed some barricades from a local city equipment lot and put them up around his business. I pass no judgment.
Did it work?
If you don't have the police coming, why not use their crowd control gear that they're not going to be using to protect your business, and some homes too. And those business owners actually became our, microcosm of the city. They became our city council. They became our mayors, because again, and a lot of these people, some of their businesses had their homes right above them. There's a lot of those old buildings with the 2-in-1s with an apartment upstairs. So some of these businesses have been owned by, third, fourth generation people. And well, the other thing too is that this was a huge immigrant neighborhood as well. People from all over the world live there. The cool thing about the Minneapolis, if you can't travel, but you live there, the world travels to you. You meet people from everywhere. So it was interesting seeing folks from California coming in, who knew how to deal with wildfire stuff, how to prepare for that, how to, get their home ready for that. But then as things got really sporty, and the police were trying to get order restored with the National Guard on the streets, and how that was starting to start looking like a civil conflict by day 4, the Friday night, when the National Guard was finally there, and they really got their butts handed to them that first night when they went out to try to take back the 3rd precinct ground. And I go into deep detail about this in the book, but there were groups of people who were business owners who put together collectives who had fled countries in Central America, where, like San El Salvador, Guatemala, Nicaragua, Colombia, and all, we have a big, the largest Somali population. A lot of these people had fled civil war, so they kind of knew what it was to prepare for outside violent groups coming into their community, and how to put up a defense and communicate and work together. And there were people who were armed, but everything was not a gun solution, right? As much as guys like us love to, teach our firearms and our defensive tactics stuff and all that, there's so much leading up to that, like good information, a network of people that you put together or you work with, I mean, the ultimate one you can think of is like United 93, bunch of strangers on a plane, didn't know each other, but in a few minutes they had to work together to, save some lives. That's an extreme example. A lot of people's neighbors are strangers. I had about 4 or 5 days into this, uh, when it was the day we left the neighborhood and left the state, we bugged out. I started getting my phone and messages blowing up from people I didn't even know who had seen. Because okay, to back this up a little bit, during that week, I was posting on like Facebook just little updates for friends who were just concerned, like knew I was in the area. And I forget that, hey, I got friends all over the country. And then it became, hey, what's going on? Are you doing okay? One thing was really cool was a lot of people around the country would contact and say, I don't, what can I do to help, man? Especially the morning after the third precinct was given up, because they're like, that neighborhood just went down. Um, the folks in that area, they're on their own, and not since probably like Hurricane Katrina, post Katrina. Had we seen something like that in the country. Now, we were not on the scale of loss and that those folks went through nearly 20 years ago now,
Mm-hmm.
but we certainly had a taste of that, and it's ugly. But it was really cool. 'Cause a lot of people around the country were, mutual friends that we have, colleagues were like, hey, I'm 1,300 miles away. You're welcome to stay in my house. People open up their doors, offering, whatever they, just because they're like, if you just need a place to rest. Um, so that community abroad was really cool. The local thing though was that there were people who I'd never met, didn't know the names, and real quick, you make friends really fast in these situations. Um,
Mm-hmm.
you can also make some enemies pretty quick too. Um, and but I was getting contacted by people outside the Twin Cities in the outer ring suburbs who there was a rumor going around, and plus a protester had said on live TV, hey, let's go out to these suburbs and start burning those places down. And really quick, they became very concerned. Like, okay, I'm getting contacted by people who are like, hey, what do I do if people in black blocs show up in my cul-de-sac, ready to burn down my house? I'm like, okay, well, why are you specifically a target for that? Or
Mm-hmm.
how, are you in a major retail center? Are you next to a government facility? Are you next to a police station? No. How far away are those? Well, they're 2, 3 miles away. Okay, then you're fine. Here's what you do. Your police are going to be tied up tonight. Go out there, talk to your neighbors in your cul-de-sac. Go ahead and block the street off. Get the barbecue grills out, and have yourself a little national night out. Enjoy yourselves. And then you know where all the kids are, where all the neighbors are, and everybody's already out there getting to meet each other. People you probably know their name. You've maybe waved at them for 10 years. Get out there and get to know them tonight. That was
Mm-hmm.
my advice. you know, yeah, of course, I'd have people ask, like, should I go out with my rifle or my shotgun? I'm like, neither, neither. If you're out in those areas, go out there with your barbecue grill, man, and have yourself a party. If you want to mask up, whatever the hell they were doing back then, that was really it. Your community is and the people around you is going to really be that information, real time information. Those are your greatest assets. Guns and gear, all that stuff is great. Um, but I had the thing I really had to talk a lot of people out of as a bad idea is like, don't go standing out in front of your house on your street in a plate carrying a rifle. If
Mm-hmm.
you're getting to that point where there is that threat there, that was probably the time to leave. When that threat's in front of your house on the street, or worse yet, on your doorstep, it's too late. And knowing that was why every morning after sunup, I had a routine. I'd go out. I had a couple of local businesses that were still open, coffee shops, um, takeout restaurant, because nobody was dining in. But I would go down those local morning watering holes and just pick up the scuttlebutt, see what the neighbors are talking about, see what they're gauge them a little bit, just kind of getting a feel. Talk to the business owners who I knew personally, and
What are you
it's
seeing? What are you hearing?
yeah, that right there was so useful. Um, because even the unspoken things, just seeing how people behave, their energy. And I could see the same people they would go out, walk their dog, go pick up their coffee. That was their contact they could make, because everything was still locked down. Um, and and you pick up so much information from that, and it was a good barometer for how things were going. The other thing was that we'd start, and while I'd be out driving around, I'd run about a 1 mile to 2 mile radius around the third precinct in my own home, and just see where they overlapped and what was going on. Any vandalism, destruction, even the small stuff. Um, I would start looking for that, and it started getting closer and closer to home. And that was where I'd start at nighttime. I'd start seeing more neighbors out. Um, Instead of just walking their dogs, they're out sitting on their porches. And then after the police station went down, we started seeing people out blocking streets, basically holding their own little block parties and watch groups. Uh, and while that became comforting for a lot of people, when the curfews are out and being enforced, the wrong people are trying to enforce them. There were situations where neighbors were carting other neighbors or people they didn't recognize and stopping them, which illegally they could not do. They weren't even supposed to be out on the street themselves. In one particular incident I talked about in the book, that led to some retaliatory gunfire. um,
So two sets of neighborhood people, neither of them looters or rioters. Somebody's out walking around and some other citizens stop them to say, what the heck you doing out past curfew? You're bad people. And then it
show us
turned
your
into
ID. Yeah,
a bit of a fight.
yeah.
You know, that brings up, you're talking about this idea of not um, sitting out on your front lawn with a plate carrier on and a rifle.
Mhm.
It brings up some like genuine questions about humanity, though, and we live in this place where we have the rule of law
Yes.
is broken as it is in current times. We don't trust the FBI, we don't trust the ATF, we don't trust federal government, state government. You know, nobody after the pandemic and all of these things, nobody trusts any authority, it seems. But we still do have, you know, if you bump my car, there is a system where I can sue and get some money and you know, blah blah blah. There's this system that we've got built out after hundreds of years. I've got a friend that's a elected state's attorney and a really good lawyer, a really good prosecutor, and he'll tell you, regardless of what you think, it's the best legal system on the planet, which I agree with. And
Yeah.
my point is, like, there is still this idea of like, this is my home, this is my block, this is my community. If not me, then who? And there's a fine line of right and wrong. Kyle
Mhm.
Rittenhouse, right? I'm going to
Mhm.
go and try to like do right. Now you're all over the news. And I'm not suggesting Kyle Rittenhouse did right
Oh
or
no.
did wrong. I'm just saying there's this idea of uh, when we leave everything to the employed protectors of our communities, if they're not doing it, I don't I don't have the obligation to sit and watch my home burn to the ground. And that might be all I have. You know, you see these videos or stories where somebody's car's getting carjacked and the guy fights, and you go, well, why didn't he just give him the car? I've been in a position as a young man, my construction truck, my stuff, tools that had taken me a decade to collect. I was at a wedding rehearsal on the west side of Chicago. My then brother-in-law was getting married, and I come out of the wedding rehearsal in a hotel, and the back window of my truck's broken,
Mhm.
and everything's gone. And my insurance didn't cover it because I wasn't on a
Right.
job site. I wasn't at home. And I erroneously thought I had insurance. I was 25 years old. I was fucked. I mean, I remember sitting there like after the fact, all the police laughed at me. They're like, you know, you're an idiot. Your stuff's gone. We're never going to find it. You know, go look at pawn shops. But that altered my life. I had to
Mhm.
borrow money to buy diapers. I had to borrow money to pay the mortgage. I had to borrow money. So I get, and somebody could say, well, you're still alive. You didn't fight the bad guys. Peace of mind, quality of life, depression, anxiety, loss of sleep, you know, all of those things. There is a value to those things. I am not suggesting go walk around your neighborhood with nods on and shoot rioters, but there's like a
Mm-mm.
fine line between run away, let monsters destroy shit, and then not do the wrong thing. I just think it was, you know, something that it is worth talking about.
Yeah, and what I call that a diminished rule of law. There's still a rule of law, but in that area, that's a diminished rule of law, DROL, right? Um, then that goes back to the why doesn't somebody just leave that area? Well, where do you go? First off, let's take the pandemic off the table. Do you have a family member who you're going to go be a glorified refugee and live on their couch?
Right. Not everybody's got that. Yeah.
Okay. Not everybody's got an RV they can load up in and go on a camping trip. Not every. Um, I
Not
talk about
everybody's got gas money.
Exactly. Not hotel. Look, we had an increasing homeless population there. I worked directly with a lot of those folks. Um, and they were evacuated. They put them up in hotels. When that happened, that was an emergency thing that they had. The cities, both Minneapolis and St. Paul, had to come up with something. It's like these folks there's nowhere for them to go. There's curfew, which they had an exclusion in that, but there was no safety. Um, and besides that, there were a lot of people who were embedded inside these camps. So suddenly our familiar homeless population weren't familiar. They were
Mm.
replaced with unfamiliar faces who were exploiting that situation. Um, there are some things that I witnessed at the time that there's an old saying in investigations: until you see the cow, there's that one dimensional image of, like, you look at it, looks like a Rorschach image, and you look at it, and then you see a Holstein cow. Eventually, if you look at it, when you see the cow, you've solved the puzzle. You've broke the case, but you don't understand the information you have in front of you. And that's what happened at the time. I was seeing all this stuff going around. I'm like, okay, there's something here. I don't know what this is. Behavior, people, patterns, places. What were they all doing? I'm not a trained intel analyst. So I reached out to or some of our mutual friends who are, who've done that in,
Mm.
the intelligence community and special warfare, those folks, and tell them, hey, here's what I'm seeing. And they're like, oh yeah, it's this, it's that. And they're using these kind of tactics. And in the years since, there's security experts who've come out and talked about what happened there and said, some of these are the same tactics that were used overseas by Boko Haram or Al Qaeda or ISIS, in Syria or anywhere in Africa, to destabilize things.
Mhm.
And you see some of that right in your own, in a Midwest city.
Mhm.
Um, and that was, over what became a social justice movement. Now, in the time since, and I think right now we have gotten really comfortable in this country. I don't like to fear monger or speculate, but live your life, but also be ready. Um, I think suddenly a lot of people are getting very comfortable because their guy got in office.
Mm.
Okay, I can relax now. I'm not worried about riots in the street. I'm not worried about, you know, uh, for the last few years, everybody just kicks around that idea of a Civil War 2.0. We got a little taste of that 5 years ago. What that would look like. Um, if people like to really fantasize scenarios, what's going on right now in California? You know, that is just a disaster. Whether it was arson or who knows. But imagine that same area that was an attack, and now you have different factions fighting over that ground, or they're just fighting it out to do attrition against each other. And the
Mhm.
authorities are like, you know what? We'll put up a perimeter around there, and if you're in that area, you're on your own. If you're outside that area, then you're over where there's a rule of law, and that's a lawless area, uh, which was pretty much what happened in Kenosha, right?
Mhm.
Hey, you know what? We'll put up a perimeter. We'll contain it. If you're in there, good luck. If you're on this side, hey, law is being enforced. You'll be held
Mhm.
accountable. Um, not to trail off here. Um, but that was something that when it came to being prepared for this stuff, I was prepared for this years in advance. Not like, hey, let's buy a house in South Minneapolis, and one day there will be civil unrest there, and I'll get to be able to employ all these preparations and skills and knowledge and education I have had and do as a professional job. And yeah, wouldn't that be fun? Hell no. I'm like, hey, this place has got a good vibe to it, man. There's really cool businesses here. There's really cool people. I like this. This is a place where I'm gonna raise a family. Everything has its own uniqueness. This fits me. It did. It changed. Uh, but and I present in this book. I had that background, that knowledge, but I tell this in this book. I tell it from the perspective of a neighbor, a family person in that neighborhood. Just one of the average people. I'm not an activist. I'm not a journalist. I wasn't out there trying to be one of the cops in the street. I wasn't a first responder. I wasn't an elected official, certainly not a politician, you know, just the person that the camera and attention wasn't pointed towards. And that was the thing that I really drove this home during a seminar we did about this a few months after the riots, was that, people's attention in civil unrest is like right at the event. That's where the media, they point their cameras there. But nobody talks about what's going on in the periphery, what's in the area around there. Look at like the January 6th situation, um, where that's at. If you know DC, yeah, there are residential areas immediately nearby there. But there aren't like, single family home developments. That's a little bit different. That's an area that's also it's a strategic location. Minneapolis was not. So they, if that had devolved into something worse, in DC at that time, there would have been resources nearby that would have put that down so fast if it had gotten
Mm-hmm.
to the level that the elected leaders were worried that would have. Um, again, I don't like getting political, but I will say this. I will acknowledge that that was an insurgency the day that the same people who call it that will acknowledge what happened in my neighborhood, my community was also an insurgency. And I'll just leave it at that. Okay.
That's it. It's an interesting point. Some of the stuff you're talking about, it makes me think of fishing.
Yeah.
I've been fishing my whole life, and you could go buy like the best boat, the best
Mm-hmm.
reel, the best polarized glasses, the best fish finder, all this stuff, and not catch fish. There's a guy I fish with in South Florida. He fishes in Pine Island Sound, which is like uh, just outside of Fort Myers area. And he grew up in the Keys. His name's Butch Barnhill. He's got this huge, thick mustache. I want to interview Butch. Butch was
Yeah.
involved in rescuing Cubans when he was a fisherman off the Keys years ago. Jimmy Carter pardoned him because he was helping rescue people out of the
Yeah.
water. Different part of the story. He's
During the
got this
Madrigal.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So
Yeah.
he's got this like very basic fiberglass, beat up, 40-year-old, like 30-foot boat with a
Yeah.
nice motor, nothing fancy. It's sound, but there's zero fancy about it. There's no radio. It's like a working man's truck, right? And I fished with him for 15 years. I been on the boat many times, and his radio will go off. Hey Butch, it's Mike. Where's the bait? I haven't been able to find any bait. I've got guys I'm taking out. Where's the bait at? He'll go, okay, you gotta, head over here and blah
Mm-hmm.
blah blah. He'll go, Mike, I've got these guys looking for snook. Where do I go? And he like, knows that he grew up on it, and he doesn't have the fancy stuff. You
Yeah.
you never don't get fish, but he's not watching the water. He's looking at the waves. He's looking at the sky. He's looking at the
Mm-hmm.
moon. He's looking at the clouds. He's looking at the weather a week ago. He's looking at like, all of this stuff. And then it's like mixed up with the fact that this is his environment. He grew up on
Yeah.
that water and just knows what it's doing. And then these guys come down there and they buy all this fancy shit. And he does not have a depth finder. He does not have a frickin' fish finder. He doesn't have any of those things. And I've never
Yeah.
been with him and not caught tons of fish and had a great time. But I think it's very analogous to this
Mm-hmm.
community of buy the stuff and and it's not just stuff. It's what are you paying attention to? Like you're saying,
Yeah.
and I don't even know if he could verbalize some of the things he's paying attention to. I've watched him just sitting in the back of the boat and I thought, what the hell is this guy thinking about? Like, how does he know to go where we're going right now?
Yeah.
And it can't just be because once upon a time he caught fish there. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. He understands that area, its history.
Mm-hmm.
He is a part of that whole that whole scene. He looks at the whole picture because he is a part of that
Mm-hmm.
whole picture.
Mm-hmm.
He is a detail in that painting, right? That's and it's so easy to tunnel in on one thing, especially our biases. Well,
Yeah.
that was really that was really something I had to really drive home. The was being patient, being open-minded, because people have preconceived notions of who's responsible, right? It really doesn't matter, because if all you're trying to do is keep your family safe, you know. Um, your home, your business, why would you stick around and defend that? Well, it may be where your shelter, your only shelter you have, even if it's just for that night and you're going to leave the next day. A lot of people did that. I did. Um, you're like, someone said, but that's my home. I get it. I do. I learned my home is my family. Wherever we are, that's my home. That's me. That's all I'll preach on that. You do you.
Mhm.
But there were a lot of people who had businesses that they started up from nothing, that came to this country with nothing, and took them years to build this up, and they didn't have insurance, or they had very little insurance. The whole thing where I'd see these looters or people out there in the street, like, what are they worried about? It's all insured. No, it's not. The building it's in is, but the inventory, all the things that people had saved and poured and sacrificed their life earnings into that, that's not covered. There
And
is no.
I'll add to that. I worked in
Mm,
that business for years in construction where people would have all the insurance,
mhm,
and it might have taken 2, 3, 4, 5 years for the insurance company to settle.
yeah,
All the while, they're not making money, and there's policies and plans where you can get paid for loss of revenue. It's not like the insurance man's running out, just dumping a truckload of cash in your pocket. That is ruinous to a small business.
yeah,
And let's be honest, if you're at a convenience store or a small restaurant or a dry cleaner or whatever, you're you're a working man or woman. You're not making millions of dollars.
no, no, you're maybe carving out a living
Mm-hmm.
and making enough maybe to supplement somebody else's living.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that's and that's what a lot of these folks. And here's the thing: some of these were businesses that people depended on, because at the time, for a nice neighborhood we had, we were a food desert. That was
Mm.
changing, but we only had maybe like 2 or 3 co-ops or supermarkets, little, affairs that, if those closed, people weren't getting anything. That was what that so that is one thing, probably the silver lining in the book is I have been told this is not a happy read. I'm just gonna warn everybody, but there is my favorite part of the book to talk about is the immediate aftermath when things started settling down or getting close to it. Was there were people who couldn't get around because public transportation was shut down for, over a week. Um, and a lot of people didn't have independent transportation, they didn't have their own car. Uber certainly isn't coming to the neighborhood.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, they may haul a few journalists in who have a security detail with them, maybe. Um, but no Lyft or Uber driver is gonna go into that. Well, now you have folks who cannot get to the local store, and they got an infant that needs formula, needs diapers. You got people who just need basic groceries and necessities. So,
Right.
immediately, some of the local businesses that were closed otherwise just said, "You know what? We're gonna go ahead and set up food donation and drop-off centers." And, they would sometimes they would just show up in the basketball court of the local junior high school. "You don't have any permission to be here. Don't care. We're here to help people set up these tables." Um, and that was one thing, was like where there was that lack of private and government infrastructure or service, people stepped up and took care of their own that way.
It's cool to see that. You often just hear people talk about how messed up the world is, but it without fail, there are good people willing to help others
Oh, yeah.
for nothing. Because I don't know the names of these people that you're talking about. Nobody gave them a freaking Medal of Freedom award. Nobody gave
Nope.
them a freaking endowment or anything. They're just nice people doing nice things for strangers.
And by the way, a lot of them want to stay anonymous.
There you go.
Um, yeah, a lot of the people who I was out there with doing this with, years later, I'm like, "Hey, you might like," they're like, "No, I don't want my name. Just tell the story, but keep me anonymous." Like,
You bring that part of the discussion brings up a great point. We often think about prepping, having this end of the world scenario where I've got to feed myself for a year. Well, how about just not have to go to the grocery store to get eggs or whatever it is you need for a week or two, so that, hey, I can hunker down here and work from the internet, spray my roof with water. Or maybe it's not this scenario. Maybe there's a bad storm, like the foot of snow
Yeah.
falling here. Just to forget just survival. How about just peace of mind? I'm
Yeah.
okay. I've got this under control. I can't go out and shoot the snowstorm. Right? I
No.
can't go out. I can't just fire rounds into the air and make some meat appear. Right.
Yeah.
So I think oftentimes it's really easy to get so far uh, off just the basic stuff. Yeah, if my neighborhood's on fire, if I've got a one little pantry in the basement with a bunch of decent canned food on it that I can sustain myself and my kids, yeah, we're not eating gourmet food for a week, but we're not dying, then life's pretty good.
Yeah. And the thing with like guns and gear, the day that I had to load up 2 vehicles and clean up my house of stuff. Because
When
anybody
you guys
had what's that?
when you guys boogied, when you
Yeah.
left?
Yeah.
Okay.
We had a little bit of time. The decision was made when the gas station on our corner was burning.
Okay.
We're like, yeah, okay, this is time
How
to leave.
far from the house was the gas station?
Kitty corner from our house.
So 50 yards, 75 yards?
Let's do about maybe 300 feet. Yeah.
Okay.
And there was built up brand new 5/1 buildings right nearby. Yeah, there and that was not the exception. Uh, there were corner gas stations burning right next to houses, like
Mm-hmm.
20 feet away with
Mm-hmm.
these unsecured propane tank cages and things like that. Um, boy, there's a lot of stuff that, if you start thinking like how to create chaos and mayhem and destroy things, you'll be a lot better off. Yeah.
Right, right.
But when it came down to loading up and, my wife went and shot what she calls the world's most boring video. Video everything in your house. If you have the time, take your phone out and just sweep around the room, every room in the house, every closet, every drawer. If you do have an insurance claim, maybe that stuff will get replaced, maybe it won't, but at least you have uh, a documentation of what you had and what you just left, you know. But we were fortunate because again, I had preparations in place for leaving, evacuating for whatever reason, and it wasn't for anything specific. It was just it just seemed like a prudent thing to do. Way years before I was into training, any of this preparedness stuff. And by the way, it's like prepper. Uh, most in the who are really extremely into it would say I'm underprepared. And how you're a professional guy at this, it's like, well, because you can't plan for every contingency, but you do have a protocol that can cover several scenarios, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because that is one thing, like working in emergency response, um, in government work, and like working in prisons and jails. Um, you have one response system that then, okay, what do we need for resources? So you figure that out. What do you need for resources? But the baseline, it was like with a evacuation scenario, you never knew what it was. And like, it was pretty low probability. We weren't in a flood area. We were high up, a couple 100 feet above the Mississippi River, which was nearly a mile away.
Mm-hmm.
We were near a major airport, plane crashing on our house. Well, we were underneath one of the red eye flight paths, pretty low probability. I would put my odds on winning the lottery over any of that. But when we did have the little bit of rioting and protesting in 2014 up the street, and then just seeing how things were becoming, I was like, yeah, time to dust that evacuation plan off and be ready. It was more to bug in, more how do we stay home and stay sane while we're all locked down. But the
Mm-hmm.
but the afternoon when, my wife and daughter uh loaded up in, the family car and went 2 hours ahead, to my in-laws farm in Wisconsin, a neighbor in Wisconsin. And I followed behind reluctantly. Oh, that was one of the hardest things I've ever had to do, was leave my home. And that hit me in a way I did not expect. I thought, hey, I'll get out here. And it's like you start looking around, you look at your neighbors who are still standing out there, and these are people who I would have seen at a gun control rally the year before. And now they're out there borrowing whatever firearm they can get their hands on, sitting in camp chairs, pulling vehicles up, and they're going to hold the line at night.
Mm.
And you're like, boy, I'm abandoning these people. They, because up to this point, you've been giving them advice on how to keep them out of trouble, how to keep them from doing something stupid. They're not stupid. They just don't know what they don't know. They don't know. They're not sitting around wondering about self-defense laws and deadly force laws and, what they can and can't do after emergency orders and curfews. Hell, even the authorities are
It's
figuring this
only
stuff
a
out.
very tiny fraction of very weird people pay.
Yeah, we're it, right? we're it. And so that right there in all of this was, there was this impression that, hey, old Mike is out there every night, he must have been out there all night, on a plate carrier of the rifle, holding it down, being the big bad hero. And hell no. I was about as incognito as it gets,
You
I,
were inside watching Golden Girls at reruns.
you know what? You read the book. Yes, that's exactly what we were doing. Golden Girls. Yeah, that was well, my girls were watching the Golden Girls. I was staying, constantly switched on to all this stuff, and again, sleeping 10, 20 minutes a day at best, going for days on end like that, and yeah, you are running on adrenaline, and boy, my blood pressure actually dropped that week. It was crazy. That's the thing, is I was wired to be doing chaos, but it's not sustainable because coming
Mm-mm.
down from that, I I was fortunate enough to have a lot of veteran friends who I was never in the service, never was, in the military, never served in a war, but I was able to talk to a lot of those people who have, and I said, what the hell is this that you're processing? Because it did have a psychological toll, especially in the aftermath of all this was far worse than the civil unrest we went through. I had, this book was a lot shorter because I cut that out, the year and a half that followed all this, because the crime that went up, the lawlessness that went
Mm.
up, it still is that way there. They are still struggling. I mean, their police force dropped. It was already low as it was, and then it really plummeted, a few months after the riots. And that was the living on edge all the time with, we had carjackings. And I looked at this and said, this is perfect for organized crime to move in here. No kidding. I was watching an interview last night from the local news up in Minneapolis. I live down in Nebraska now, but they have the new police chief there. He's been there a couple years. He was from Camden, New Jersey, so they hired him in to get Minneapolis running. But it got to the point where the outgoing U.S. attorney there in Minneapolis and Minnesota is using RICO statutes against some of these criminals who have been running, doing dirt on the streets, who came in the
Mm.
vacuum of those riots. And I had told neighbors, and I even told, any city council person who would listen, they never do. Hey, you need to get on top of this now. You're going to have organized crime in this city like you've never seen. Not talking about, your young kids on the corner just doing whatever. Like, no, organized guys, like mafia level, not the
Mm-hmm.
traditional mafia, but definitely organized and sophisticated enough that they become a parallel government. Um, because that's, that's what we had during the unrest for those few days. Was you had parallel governments popping up. We had those of us who were protecting our own, looking out for each other, and any non-participant, any innocent person. And then there were those who were also their own parallel government, who were involved in the rioting, involved in the activism, in the different
Mm-hmm.
levels and stages of that. So, um, but um, that was um, that was certainly something I didn't expect, but it was there. And again, I can only draw that conclusion based on history. You look at what happened in other cities in decades before, where there was that kind of
Mm.
collapse that followed some major unrest. was a nice neighborhood once upon a time. People like in LA, Compton, Watts, these get reputations, bad reps for decades that they were always these, high crime areas full of gang and drugs and violence. No, they weren't. These were
No, they
middle
were nice
class
neighborhoods.
neighborhoods. They were wonderful neighborhoods. But some things happened and people moved out. Things changed. Detroit,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
1967 still hasn't recovered, you know. I would say Minneapolis, there's a lot of gaslighting going on there, always has been, but it's kind of a cultural thing there in Minnesota. Um,
Don't you know?
yeah. And they're like, oh, you're pretending all this stuff. This stuff didn't happen. Right? It's not as bad as you think. It's like, really, it's not as bad. So then explain to me why the neighbor down the street here has been carjacked twice. I mean, twice, and interviewed on the news about it. How about the guy down the street just sitting in his car to get a little private time because everybody
Right.
cooped up in the house just got shot in the face, survived in a gunfight with 5 carjackers.
Wow.
Well, he fired back. I talk about this in the book as well, but or later on. But yeah, that crime, that explosion in crime, street crime, I knew that was going to happen. Um, and people say, "Why the hell you stay there once you get up?" Well, I guess I could uproot my kid out of school. Um, you know, fortunately, my spouse could work remotely, but I still had a job that tied me down there. I have a business to run too, and business got pretty good for a little while there. Again, some of those same folks neighbors who knew what I taught and did were like, "Oh yeah, I want all guns banned and all this." And next thing I know, a year later, they're like, "Hey, I'm building my 5th AR-15, man. Cool, you own more of them than I do now."
Right, right, right.
Yeah.
That's funny.
When I was bugging out with all that gear, right, sneaking it out into the van, I was like, man, I'm glad I have enough. I don't have more than I can just carry in 2 hands and on my back. Because if I had a lot of the stuff that most people we know and do, and students have, had, you've had, we've all had.
Mm-hmm.
My plan was like, hell, I don't want that falling in the wrong hands. Well, over there is the Ford Parkway Bridge, and there's the Mississippi River locking dam number 3 or 4. Okay, dumping it in there. Well, I don't care. It's that stuff I'll replace gladly, but not having to run out with grandma's china and all that stuff. And I remember seeing that and talk about this in the book. But all these people who suddenly were showing up with their brother-in-law's trailer in his truck, loading the antique china hutch or whatever out of the house. They may have stayed there,
Mm-hmm.
but if the place went up, they wanted to get the valuables out, or they just flat out moved out that day. Said, hell with it, I'm putting the place up on the market. That happened too. And I was thinking, God, property values are going to drop. No, they went up. They continue
Did they
going up.
really?
Oh God, they still are. They still are because people are willing to take that risk. The real turning point when we really decided we're going to leave this place was about 2 months after. I don't talk about this in the book. I was going to put this in a follow-up book, but we'll see. But we had a guy got smoked out in front of our house one night. It's a Monday night going into Tuesday, about 2 minutes after midnight. And I hear pop, 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 12 shots. And, the firearms instructor me is counting trigger cadence and shot cadence and all this, knowing the distance, knowing it's lateral. This ain't fireworks. This is lateral. This is on ground level. This isn't going up in the air, going sis pop, boom. This is bang, bang. Now that shooter's dialed in on their target and now they're just doing mag dump. And having heard these shots before, somebody doing a pistol mag dump, usually 15 rounds. They get around 11 or 12 and their little fingers get tired because they don't train at this stuff. Who does a mag dump, right? But yeah, a guy got killed out in front of our house. Got killed fleeing. Um, Still an unsolved case to my knowledge, still a cold case. Um, Police showed up. Um, that was 4 officers showed up, and 2 of them were FTOs and 2 of them were their trainees, fresh on the street. And the most senior officer had 2.5 years on the job,
Wow.
and he's already happened to play homicide investigator too. He's happened to do all sorts of things because they're that short. But yeah, I had neighbors who had just bought a house and moved in, and others who were gonna make updates and plant roots even deeper and have a second kid on the way, and they were like, nope, put their place up for sale. and people moved in and bought it, you know. So the property values did not go down. But when that happened, there were a few neighbors like, well, God, you know, we just moved in here and it took us a lot to get this place and we paid all this money for it way above market value. We were competitive, you know, in the seller's market. We can't just walk away from this. Well, that was an isolated incident. And then you get to talking about old timers in the neighborhood who've lived there for a while. Like, well, this wasn't always like this, you know. Curbside appeal was something we always stayed up on, you know.
Mm.
And now we have plywood everywhere with graffiti everywhere, you know, needles laying everywhere, overdose dead bodies laying at left turn signals, you know, where the guy was sign bagging 2 hours earlier, you know, and just,
Sure.
yeah, you know, and I'm like, it's amazing that, you know, it's like a little miniature version of Frisco or these other troubled
We
cities.
we've seen that stuff sweep across America for sure. People
Yeah.
have this. I don't know. Some people try to make it too simple, and they just say it's a lack of respect. But I think there's 100 factors all coalescing:
Yeah.
an education system, parenting, lack of respect, lack of self excellence and self worth, and there's 100 factors that are coming together. But I do some work out in Washington, Olympia, outside of Olympia, and uh, I used to stay in Olympia in a nice little rental house. Now I don't. I used to go into Olympia to a couple restaurants the last time that I did, and I know there's great people in Olympia, but last time I did, I had to get up about every 20 minutes and walk out to my truck. Not because I'm paranoid, I don't do this, but because as I came in, there were people sticking needles in their arms right outside. And it's like, man, it's really easy for somebody to break a window and, you know, help themselves to the stuff in my truck. And
Yeah.
there was a tree outside the restaurant, a very nice, just right to steps from the Capitol, where the tree had hundreds of needles just stuck in the bark. Nobody thought to, nobody, it was like, you know, like weird drug art. Nobody was
Yeah.
cleaning it up because who wants to touch drug needles? And I remember just looking at that. I'm like, what the hell? So the guy that hosts us out there lives outside of town now, about 20 miles, and he's in his 70s. He said as a kid, he's like, you know, it was the greatest thing ever. Kids riding their bikes around town. It was, you know, Americana, you know, baseball and apple pie and all that shit. And it's crushing. So you
Yeah.
know, this de-evolution of our society and our cities, it's it sucks. It
Yeah.
sucks for sure.
And, you know, you hate to see your community that you were part of, that you were a stakeholder in, that you raised your family in, you
Mm,
know, uh,
yeah,
go that way. But things change, you know.
they do. And that's tale as old as time, right? People
Yeah.
moved the indigenous people here to the Americas, chased the buffalo around and chased the rains and got away from winter. I mean, you go where people are going to do people stuff.
Yeah.
How do
And
people? Go ahead.
no, go ahead.
No, you.
You had a question. I didn't. I was looking at
I was going to
something
say,
here.
how do people find the book?
Oh, it's on Amazon where you can find everything else. Yeah, Minnehaha Falling, Memoir of the 2020 Minneapolis Riots, Michael Treat. Yeah, it's on there. It's in print and it's also on the Kindle. Um, and at some point, we might work on an audio version of it here. um, but yeah, you can get it in print or Kindle in there. And
Very cool.
yeah, it's a bit of a lengthy read. 430 something pages, and I have several pages of cited references. I'll put it this way: every one of those references that's cited in that book, there's between 20 and 30 for each one that I didn't put in the book. So
You spent some
um,
time.
yeah, yeah, you know, and this was going to be a much longer book, but you know, I had to have a cutoff point on it, and there's so much that I did not get to present in the book, but I narrowed it down to that event of about 10 days from when this started until when finally state emergency was called off and the National Guard were going home and some order was restored. Um, and that's not the authorities who restore order. That's people who restore order, either usually by volunteering to participate or not.
Mm.
You know, because you could put the entire active military that we have in this country on the street with every cop we have on the street, and the population dictates how that's gonna go. You know, so just seeing a microcosm of that. Um, you could do a lot of scenario what ifs and a lot of brainstorming, but when you actually see what that looks like, that again, a little microcosm of it, that gives you some insight of what would happen if things really went on a bigger scale.
Did it change you at all, Mike?
Yeah, yeah. Um, it's probably not until recently that I, don't just go to work and come home. But like I did not want to be around people for a long time. Crowds. Crowds always kind of exhaust me anyway because of what I do for a living. But, I would see I'd see traffic slowing down ahead. It might just be an accident, it might just be it's busy. Didn't care. There were a couple times I'd start popping curbs, driving over, boulevards, making U-turns, illegal U-turns just because I'm like, ain't going up there and getting stuck in that. Been there, done that. Don't want to do it again. And then that, became like, I'm constantly watching the ways and the social media apps and what's going on. And you're like, just being that hyper vigilance wears you down after a while.
Sure does. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And then, luckily I was able to go travel to a couple places right after this. Um, taking I went out to a class for a week in Phoenix. Yeah, man, that was a great break, you know. I got to spend a week with all of our friends and colleagues out there, doing a class with Masada Yub, that week. And it was just kind of like I got to leave all that behind for a minute, forget about it. But when
Hmm.
I got back, it's like, whoa, um, and now I live in a place where I would say the risk mitigation, I don't have to do as much, you know. Um, Daughter's off to college in another state, so I can kind of relax a little bit. But yeah, there were years where the last few years where it was like, yeah, this is exhausting how hyper vigilant I was. And I thought it was just, okay, I'm being paranoid. But then when you see, my wife was going through that too. And, having seen that going on, I'm like, okay, this is really affecting her, you know. And and then seeing neighbors, back in the old neighborhood, same thing. I'm like, yeah, you guys, you might need to get some help. It's okay, Um, writing this book, I guess, I don't know, somebody said that's therapeutic. I guess so. Why I wrote this book real quick was it had started with me telling these stories, the experience over and over and over for the weeks that followed this. And
People asking.
yeah, or I would just share it. Starting on social media with the posts in there, and which was just me and letting concerned friends know what was up. Um, and then I got asked to be a guest speaker on a seminar that Active Self Protection did, and went on there and talked about the experience on their program back. I think it was August of that year. You can find it over at their website, Riot Survival Seminar. And then I ended up doing. My wife and I did a seminar of our own, online seminar about our experience and all that. And I'm more of a storyteller than I am a give you a list of things to do. I'll do that too, but I think it's better for somebody to take the story and they derive their own list and lessons from that, from those lessons out of that. So I decided to tell the long form. But I'd been on another podcast radio show over the couple years following this, and I just got exhausted talking about it all the time. So I'm like, okay, I'm going to put this in a book, and then if anybody wants to hear about it, read about it, I can give them a little synopsis, and then they can go get into that. But now having done the book, I'm able to talk about it a lot more. Well, obviously I got to promote the book, but I wrote this so that people will hopefully get a history lesson from this. You know, because I could not find anybody who wrote a book about what it was like living in the 92 LA riots. I had known some retired cops who were rookies or they were retiring when that happened. None of them are alive anymore either. You
Wow.
know,
I guess it's 30 some odd years. Fuck, man, what the heck?
yeah, I was just wrapping up high school when that went down, and I was getting ready to go, cop school myself. In the 90s there, we had that, and then we had, it was funny when I was going through all that schooling in the mid 90s there, they would change everything in our training. When the OJ case happened, hey, now we're gonna handle, crime scene processing, evidence handling procedure. That's that we have to be, we have to up our game on that. When the North Hollywood shootout happened, now you got to be tactical patrol, then Columbine, and on and on and on.
Mhm.
So, of course, I was off in the prison system then, so working in that, so I was spared a lot of that stuff afterwards. But yeah, I could not find anybody who wrote a memoir or anything other than sociologists, um, maybe criminologists who wrote these academic books about what happened in York, Pennsylvania, or Baltimore, or any of those places, in the 60s or the 70s. Um, but there was not a boots on the ground retelling of any of these things. I hope that there are more people who will do that, who experience that. Um, there's been journalists, but again, these are people who tell it through the lens of a journalist, an activist. A lot of activists have written books about this. Um, but no, to my knowledge, no everyday average citizen who's living in the middle of this, who's in the periphery, who is affected by it, but doesn't have the camera pointed at them. And that's not to draw some attention and say, hey, we're these poor victims and everything. But should somebody find themselves in a situation where there is sustained civil unrest, or lawlessness, or they could be in another country where this happens, where it pops off, or another city, wherever it is, not on their home turf, at least having a little bit of an idea how things work, because how they progressed. Because and I talk about this in a chapter in the book, like when the rioting really kicked up at the third precinct and the looting started and the fires began. We were trying to think, hey, okay, if this really blows up, how long will this last? We figured about 5 days, because we were gauging based off the LA riots in 92 and the Watts riots in 65 and then the ones that they had in 67 in Detroit. So American history tells you a lot there, um but a whole different time. They didn't have a pandemic going on either, and it wasn't during an election year. What a trifecta.
Mhm.
So, but that was why I
Crazy,
wanted to
man.
write this, so people they can read the stories, they can glean some lessons from it. Maybe they can apply some of this to their own situation to stay safe. Um, I'm always happy to hand them an outline of, yeah, here's what to do, but it's 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 you make your own first aid kit instead of going out and buying one. you
I
know,
dig it. I
because you're
dig
gonna
it.
have to put your own knowledge and skills behind it. So,
Right, right, right.
yeah,
I appreciate you taking the time to share some of this stuff. Uh, it's easy to sit like we discussed and talk about the guns and gear and the fun training programs and rolling around in the dirt and all that.
do
But
that stuff.
yeah,
Yeah,
that stuff's very important. But
yeah.
to me, it's not as important. It's a thing. It's not the thing, and it's too easy to get caught in that thing. Uh, Final words. If you were never meet the people that you met today, doesn't have to even do with the discussion at hand. What would you leave people with? They never met you or never crossed your path again.
Be patient, be open minded, um, take care of each other, look out for each other, you know, to the best of your ability. Um, and that's really it, man. You know, um, be a good human being. uh, I mean, I go a little altruistic on it, but it's true. That's you know, take people who could be a potential enemy, and treat them kindly, like they're a friend, like they're a human being. I work with an inmate population. It's easy to look down on people like that, right? But again, that guy might be in there because his tools were stolen out of his truck, and he had bills to pay and mouths to feed, and opportunity came along, and it was the best one he had, and it wasn't right, but there he is. That's what he had, the circumstances.
Hmm.
So again, if you can treat people who you would look down on as human beings, maybe it's not for their benefit, but boy, it does a lot for your own soul. And that
It's
is
good
something you
medicine,
do
man.
not want to lose. Yeah,
That's good. It's good medicine right there. I
absolutely.
appreciate you, man. I appreciate you taking the
I
time to do
appreciate you,
this.
Mick. Thanks for the
You guys,
opportunity.
what's your contact information? How do people find you? You got a website? You got an
Yeah.
Instagram, YouTube, Facebook? How do they do it?
So for the book, right up there, the little QR code. Yeah, you can find it Minnehaha Falling book. That's the website for the book, or you can go to my training company page, Condition Orange Preparedness. I tried to get a shorter name, but it just wasn't available. Yeah, conditionorangepreparedness.com. That'll also have links to the book. That'll have links to other interviews, podcasts, any of the other media stuff that might have stuff we forgot to talk about today. Yeah, in the book you'll get that. I also at some point I'll have we'll have a little YouTube channel coming up with a few videos about some of the little talking points some of them we discussed here today, but going a little bit more in depth, shorter
Awesome.
bite-sized videos. But yeah, we should have a YouTube channel coming up for Minnehaha Falling. But yeah, you can get the book right there on Amazon. And any folks in the Nebraska Omaha area, there's a local store here, three of them that carry it, called the Book Nook. And they actually offered a discounted price over there, so help out the local business there. They've been kind enough
Nice.
to support us, so yeah.
I like it.
Yeah, yeah.
Thank you so much, sir. I
Thank you.
wish you well and hope you never get caught in that situation again. You guys that tuned in today, if the story was meaningful, uh, pass it on, share it with people. It's interesting during these times uh, that the story was based on that what we're talking about today, like Mike brought up, people that are not interested in swimming all of a sudden are really concerned about swimming when it's raining a bunch and the earth is flooding. I had family members over this last 5 years. Anybody in the community that most of us reside in had a situation like this where, hey man, should I get a shotgun? Should I get this? Should I get that? And we all smiled, but we understood. It's important that we don't wait until the waters rising to figure out how to swim. Stories like this are a good reminder for people. And I think it's a book like that. It's a great thing. If you got a friend that's reading, enjoys reading, pass that on. Buy a couple of them and send them to your friends. That's actually something I like to do. I buy books and I give them to my friends
Mm,
because paper is good and all this video shit is bad for our brains, even though I do it. Sit down, read a book, light a fire, drink a beer or a whiskey or a nice
yeah,
coffee.
yeah,
I
yeah.
dig it.
And they don't need batteries or charging or anything like that.
That's true. You could sit with a candle and read it.
Yeah.
You guys be well. Don't be dickheads. Walk the higher line.
Visit our website, carrytrainer.com, for information about classes held throughout the U.S., Carry Trainer apparel, and upcoming projects. You can also email us at training@carrytrainer.com for information about setting up your own private course or speaking engagement. Training@carrytrainer.com or carrytrainer.com.